GM, welcome to another Touchgrass podcast episode. This is undoubtedly one of the biggest podcasts that we've had on this channel. We have the man himself, Charles. Thank you so much for taking out the time.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Awesome. Charles, you require no introduction to my audience or crypto Twitter in general. I think one story that's sort of abstracted away because it's been so many years. Tell us the founding story of Input Output. Like, how did it start and how's the journey been so far?
Well, Input Output started as a kind of a project-oriented company. After the whole Ethereum debacle, I was like completely done with crypto. I'm just like so tired. I don't want to do this anymore because, I didn't have the best of experience with BitShares and the best of experience with Ethereum. So I was 0-2 and everybody around me is like, you're not really good at this entrepreneur thing. So then I got all these Japanese people who are like, hey, do you want to do the Ethereum of Japan? I was like, well, I do have the unused roadmap from when I was at Ethereum. It was very tempting. So I flew out to Japan, and after being there for a little bit, I came to the conclusion that I'd give it one more try. But I said, I got to do it the way I want to do it. So I need some autonomy on the technology side and some autonomy on the product development side. So we negotiated that out, and I built Input Output initially just to deliver Cardano. But then after we built the largest research group in the world for cryptocurrencies, like 168 scientists and 250 papers and all these engineers, I said it'd be really a shame just to let them all go after we delivered the initial roadmap. It'd be fun to kind of pivot the company a little bit and turn it into a venture studio. And so we started that transition in 2022. And now we're almost finished with it, and you can see the culmination with like the launch of Midnight and things like RealFi and Quantum Hosky and Lace and other things coming next year. So we're a very productive company, and about half of our time is still on Cardano, and we're core engineers. But now we also build dApps and DeFi that are kind of cross-chain. So it allowed us to get to know the industry in a very different way.
That's wild. For context, like I only knew about Cardano and Midnight. The fact that it's a product studio and it's a venture studio and you're doing so many different things is amazing. Do you have like a core memory or a key memory of Input Output that you'd like to share with the audience? Like this was like the wildest time, in my opinion.
Well, 2015 was a wild time. I only had $200,000. We had no idea what we were doing. We had the culture shock of operating in Japan and Hong Kong as white guys from Colorado. And so it was just wild because you're like living on a different planet and you have no money, and you just have to like find a way to survive. And I'll give you a great example, just how weird Japan gets. I lived in this apartment that was like $400 a month on the Mitasuji line, far outside of the city in Osaka. And I'd ride the Mitasuji every day to our office in Homachi. And anyway, as I was riding the Mitasuji, they had these woman-only train cars there, and they were marked pink and everything. So I said, I can't ride that train car. They said, no, you can ride it today. So it's like a Wednesday. So I get on the train car, and I was like, that's pretty cool. So the next Wednesday, I was like, yeah, it's Wednesday. So men can ride the women's only car. I get in, and everybody's staring at me, and eventually someone kicks me off the car, and it's like, where is it written down, like when men could use the women-only car or not? I don't understand this. This is insane. So it's like all these unspoken rules. You stand on the right in Osaka on the escalator. You stand on the left on the escalator in Tokyo. No one writes any of these things down, but you're expected to know it, and they shame you if you don't. So all of 2015 was that way. And then also it was a transition year for the industry because the second generation was just coming online. Ethereum hadn't quite shipped yet. Everybody was talking about it. BitShares was starting to enter its phase, as was NXT and these other things, and it wasn't really clear if it was going to be like Mastercoin style layer 2 stuff on Bitcoin, or if it was going to be a layer 1 that won, and if so, what's the paradigm that would win, where you have kind of the ledger provides the dApps like BitShares with on-chain DEX and algorithmic stablecoin, or if you wanted to have a full programmable system like Ethereum. So we weren't really sure, where that was going to go, and I had to kind of figure out how to navigate that roadmap and pick the technology. And it was also weird because I was interviewing all these different tech stacks. Like I talked to the founder of Scala, Martin Odersky, and I talked to Rich Hickey, who's kind of like Bob Ross for programming. Yeah. He created Cloture. And so I could just call these guys up and be like, I'm trying to pick a programming language. It was almost like dating, like who gets the golden rose. So I'm trying to pick a programming language for this Cardano thing I'm working on. And I ended up picking Haskell for it. But, maybe that wasn't the best of ideas. I don't know. It was awesome from a certain lens, and it carried its own problems from a different lens. But it was a wild time because we had all these unlimited possibilities, and it was so much fun.
Can you talk me through like the second generation, third generation? I watched your keynote the other day about the fourth generation. Can you summarize the second and third, and then
Yeah.
we talk about the fourth a
Well,
little
every
bit more?
generation it brings something new. So you preserve and protect the things of the old generation. So Bitcoin was the first, obviously, and there it was just about disintermediated value transfer. This idea that you don't need a middleman to allow you to move digital value between one person to another. The second is just about programmability, and so it says, okay, now that you have value transfer, you want arbitrary value transfer. You want the ability to issue your own assets. You want the ability to write smart contracts and these types of things. But that's not sufficient. You also need scalability, interoperability, and governance. The problem is the minute you have these systems, they're very complicated and they need to be upgraded and tuned on a regular basis. You're not really decentralized if your upgrades and tunes only come from a central entity. So you need an on-chain government system, which is distinctly different from just a smart contract. It's a ledger level concern. And then also you have to think really carefully about how you're going to have these systems talk to each other. So you have to start standardizing how smart contracts work, state management works. And then obviously you need these things to scale. And the types of protocols that we had with Ethereum and Bitcoin don't scale. Proof of work in a Nakamoto sense really doesn't. So proof of stake had to come in, and you had to create like scalable proof of stake protocols. So the third generation really got started around 2017, 2018, and now we're almost about 75% of the way through it. So now we're headed towards the fourth generation. But that's usually what happens. It's like the first generation got long in the tooth around 2012, 2013. And second generation came in around 2014, 2015, and then it got really good around 2017, 2018. And now we're kind of late stage Gen 3, where most people have a pretty good eye on the prize for the blockchain trilemma, for scalability. We're starting, like you guys and others, about the interoperability and figuring out how to move value and information between different chains. We're getting really good at that. And we're starting to get a real good handle on DAOs and on-chain governance and how to upgrade things. So most of the problems of third generation are getting resolved within the next 3 to 5 years.
What is your vision for the fourth generation?
It's the last mile. And so there's always a question like when mainstream adoption, like when do the institutions come? When do we get the real world assets? When do we get all of the legacy businesses to take cryptocurrencies seriously? And the reality is they can't do that without privacy and identity. Because compliance is a fundamental component of any business. You got to pay your taxes. You got to report things to the government. You got to get audited. You have to preserve the privacy of your users. You can't do that in an open, transparent system. You need a private side and a public side. You need an identity layer inside the system. And usually you beg a new generation when the capabilities of the prior generation aren't sufficient or are so highly fragmented that it makes more sense to build some bespoke technology to accommodate that. So like you can always achieve scalability in the second generation, for example, using on a DApp by DApp approach, but ledger level ubiquitous scalability requires like a new generational approach, fundamentally new consensus algorithm. Analogously, you can always achieve privacy on a DApp by DApp basis in the third generation. But if you want like a universal selective disclosure and rational privacy system, you have to build that into the guts of the system as a whole, which is why we built Kachina. So really, those two things alone justify the existence of a new generation, because you're talking about usually about 1 billion users and $10 trillion worth of assets. Every time you get a generation, you 10x it. The other side of it is cooperation. There's too many cryptocurrencies. There's too many things going on. And what we've noticed with latecomers to the third generation is they're not able to change the network effect. SWI launched, it's much better technology in many respects from Solana or Ethereum, but very few people have moved over relative to Solana, Ethereum, despite enormous investments and hard work. And it's a very good team. It's just people are sticky. They like staying in their areas where they're at. So you need a fundamentally different paradigm that handles the network effect. So like the API economy gives you something to think there. You see, like, let's have something where I can pay in the token that I have, I can stay on the network I'm in, and I just augment and extend it to gain a capability, as opposed to trying to migrate the user, the DApp, and the entire experience over to a different system.
Got it. Do you still keep up with like the Ethereum community? Have you been noticing all the, scale the L1 meta that's been going on? The L2 landscape has sort of pivoted in terms of the Ethereum Foundation. Would you say that's more of a later Gen 3 situation where the Ethereum Foundation is trying to consolidate? Do you have any advice? for the Ethereum community?
Well, they've done a great job articulating how they want to achieve scale and figuring out interoperability. They haven't done the best of jobs with governance because there's still a heavy reliance on the EF kind of being the vision thing and figuring out how to lead the ecosystem down the road. But they've done a good job in terms of figuring out protocol level decentralization from like a node viewpoint. They have a lot of alternative clients and independent development teams and these types of things. But Vitalik just doesn't like on-chain government, and I do, and that's just one of the big philosophical wedges between us. As does Gavin. He likes on-chain government. I thought for sure that Ethereum would have to throw in the towel, and Tezos and Cardano and Polkadot would be more successful with this. But it seems like the centralized development model still is a thing. But we follow it. We're one of the few firms outside of the Ethereum Foundation and others that have actually built a full Ethereum node. We did that with Mantis when we created a Scala node. And we know a lot about the technology. We actually were one of the first with Grigori Roshu at UIUC to formalize the EVM with the KEVM. So we know how the EVM works. We know where all the bodies are buried there. We kind of know how to write an Ethereum node, and we follow the EIPs and we kind of read them and see, are they sensible or not? And really where we intersect a lot is in the privacy conversation. So they're pushing for a lot of hash-based crypto, and they're thinking about Starks, and they have this whole vision about how to achieve like gigagas inside their system using a Stark-based system. Their big challenge is they're betting big on ASICs, and we just think it's fundamentally wrong. You should be betting big on GPUs. And so what we're trying to do on the privacy side is we embrace different mathematical primitives. We're embracing lattices. They embrace hashes. And we think lattices with tensor codes can allow you to use GPUs for linear scalability. So I can reuse everything that Google has with cloud and Azure has and Amazon has, and I don't have to build ASICs for it. But we follow it. The other thing that they're doing that's really, really interesting is they have this huge L2 ecosystem, and right now they're quite parasitic to the chain. And the problem is if they're processing all your transactions and they're doing all your stuff, it's really easy for them to wake up one day and say, hey, we're just going to become our own L1, or we're going to attach to a different network and take all the users with us. So what they have to reconcile is how do you bring those users back home into the chain and create positive economic value on both sides? We co-developed the L2 and L1 of Cardano together. We have Hydra and in Cardano. And because of that, we're now seeing all these Hydra applications that like Delta DeFi and others that are coming that get all the advantages of being an L2, but they use ADA, not another token, as their fuel. Yeah. So they don't need to like run a whole network. So I think in hindsight, if he could get a do-over on how his L2 ecosystem came out, but it's important to understand how you get into those problems. Like the reason it occurred was they were too late on scalability. So they needed some sort of stopgap while they were getting scalability solutions into Ethereum. And so the L2 ecosystem was that stopgap. But now
is that something that you predicted when it was sort of emerging that this will be a problem that Ethereum will face in terms of scalability?
Yeah, because they screwed up on the consensus side. I thought they were going to win. Because we and Elaine Shih were competing very aggressively back in 2016. There was the tale of the two papers. We had Ouroboros and she had Snow White. And Elaine was really good friends with Ming at the Ethereum Foundation. And she was at Cornell and really bright person, wonderful professor. And so we thought for sure that what Vitalik was going to do is just give a bunch of money to Elaine and her team. And they would have taken Snow White and Fruit Chains and Thunderella and all these advancements. And they would have had proof of stake at scale in Ethereum by around 2017. So we were working our asses off to figure out like how do we get Ouroboros in and do all these other things because man, Ethereum's going to be in 12 to 24 months. Instead, they went down the Casper route with Casper Labs, and they just went in just a horrible direction, and it was an unmitigated disaster for them. And so they added about 3 years to their wait list. And the challenge there is that while things like Thunderella and Snow White, they had a really obvious way to scale, the way that they approached proof of stake in the beginning didn't, which is why they had to restart the program again and again and again. So that delay is what led to the layer 2 revolution on Ethereum because people needed something as a stopgap while they were waiting. And so it was very predictable that these guys would come out. And the minute they have their own token, even if they want to be your friend, they have bag holders. They have to actually preserve and protect that. And they can't like sacrifice their bag holders for the cult of Ethereum. There's always an unhealthy friction that exists there. So that was very predictable, but how they're going to put that cat back in the bag is kind of the big challenge for them. They're victims of their own success.
That makes sense. I think like every time I listen to you on stage or on video, or even now, it's very evident that you're like, I would have always assumed that you were just tapped into your own ecosystem, but it's remarkable that you're always tapped into everything else. One thing that I found really interesting yesterday when you were giving your keynote about Midnight is you talked about how Midnight is the best of all the worlds. Can you bring back the conversation to privacy and Midnight and talk about what does that mean?
Well, everybody who's building something in this space, they have, if they're real, they have passion, they have good technology, they have a community. And one of the biggest tragedies of the space is because of tokenomics, we've gotten ourselves, we paint ourselves in a corner where we all just have to hate each other. I mean, I have philosophical disagreements with Anatoly about certain things in Solana, but it doesn't mean I can't admire the work they've done on Fire Dancer. I have disagreements with Gavin all the time, but we use parity substrate actually for Midnight. So there's all kinds of things in the space that we admire and respect. And if it's just a token and a bag holder situation that gets between us, then we have to solve that. So the very first and most fundamental thing that we've tried to solve with Midnight is to create a broad distribution. We distributed 8 ecosystems, 7 chains with the Glacier drop, but then also let people pay in the underlying currency that they own and make it feel like it's a layer 2 to everybody, make it feel like it's an extension of their infrastructure. The minute you do that, the hostilities melt away. And then you can have legitimate conversations about the value of selective disclosure and regulated commerce. You say, look, whether you like it or not, the next 5 years, the majority of growth of our industry is going to be stablecoin growth and real world asset growth. Both of these are going to require a compliance layer. And that's just how it's going to be. I don't make those rules, but that's what they carry with them. So if we're smart about it, that can be 100% blockchain based, and that can be 100% smart contract based and fully automated, and we can still have settlement occur on our systems. Otherwise, you'll have to go through an intermediary, which defeats the entire purpose of having a blockchain infrastructure to begin with. So let's talk about what we need to do to make this scale, what we need to do to make this work, and ultimately what the conversation needs to look like so that the governments, the institutions, and the Web3 people can all be at the table together, just like a table like this, and we can kind of sort it all out. And let's use a neutral place for all that to happen. Otherwise, you'll have one chain try to set all the standards for all the other chains. And then they'll try to do this winner takes all thing, and it's not going to work well for anybody. And also, the biggest competition's not blockchain to blockchain. The biggest competition is the Magnificent Seven. Google and Microsoft, Apple, they command billions of users, and they have an unfair competitive advantage. They control your phone. They control your web browser. So at any given moment, they can build into the operating system, the web browser, and the phone their own wallets, their own standards. And so if they decide to enter our space, which they are, now that clarity is coming out, they can flip a switch and basically have a network effect beyond what we have as an industry. So while we all, like kids around a table, squabble and fight each other, like the big guys can come in and they can just crush us if they want to. So we have to recognize that the only way we can prevent that from happening is to work together, and we have to cooperate in some respect. And then we can make their users our users. And when you do the math, it's like tens of trillions of dollars that comes into the industry. There's plenty of money to come around. It's like we get along with the Sui guys. They do Bitcoin DeFi. We do Bitcoin DeFi. And it's like we're not really competitors because we did the math and we're like, look, if you get $1 trillion and I get $1 trillion, we're still doing okay, right? So we can collaborate on standards. And the same with us in the Hedera hash graph with the DREC Alliance, or us in the XRP community, and a lot of the things we look at. There's a lot more to be gained from cooperation. And that's really the raison d'etre of Midnight, is start with the cooperative elements and then solve a real problem, in this case, disclosure and privacy, and then try to solve that in a way that doesn't require Bitcoin to have to upgrade itself or Ethereum to have to upgrade itself. And so they can focus on their generational issues.
That's super interesting. I love how you talked about community and communities having differences, but, as a founder, as someone who's looking after the community, maybe it's not the best to receive that community feedback. Is that something that you think about a lot? Do you spend a lot of time on crypto Twitter, listening to the Cardano community, listening to other communities and sort of forming your view? Does that sort of give you any chatter or noise in terms of the roadmap?
Well, the single most important thing is to have objective, measurable, meaningful KPIs about a healthy ecosystem versus an unhealthy one. If you don't have that, then what ends up happening is you get stuck in these traps that are oftentimes connected to vanity things. Like, for example, the price. I have no control over it. Vitalik has no control over his price. Mike Saylor has no control over the price of Bitcoin. So, if you look at all the measurable things on Cardano in terms of its technology, its roadmap, its success, we went from a federated governance model to a completely decentralized governance model this year with an on-chain constitution, the largest DAO in the industry. $1.5 billion on-chain treasury got turned on. That's a huge achievement. But it gets hidden under the fact that the price is down because the macro looks bad. So you look to crypto Twitter and it just gets flooded with so much irrational drama of you're a scammer, you're an evil person, you failed, Cardano's dead, and all this stuff. You're like, okay, and so you have to start with KPIs. And then once you have that, then where you can have a conversation with your community is what is the strategy to achieve these things? What are the top 10 to 25 dApps we need? What are the top 10 to 25 growth areas that we should focus on? What are the big 4 events we should go to next year? Like, should it be Token 2049 and Consensus and Bitcoin, or should it be South by Southwest and Web Summit? What should it be? And then how do we make sure we have a strong showing there so that we gain adoption? How do we get better incubation acceleration for our dApps? How do we get tier 1 exchange listings for these things, or tier 1 stablecoin in the ecosystem? That's a meaningful conversation, and you can have an end goal with that. Either it happens or it didn't happen, right? And you can look at the end of the year and do a retrospective and say, okay, what did we do well? What didn't we do well? And hold people accountable. So I listen from that lens and that perspective. The best way to do that is through a members-based organization. Okay. So in our case, Intersect is there. And that's because you have your product people, your technical people, your community managers, your governance people, all in the same organization. And it's a representative sample of the totality of the ecosystem, and including all the dApps and DeFi in the ecosystem. And they will be very frank about what in the product roadmap is not good and what in the product roadmap is good and working for them. Twitter is one of the worst mechanisms, because you never know who's real and who's not real. You never know. There's no verifiability of who's actually a community member or not. And also, there's no good tools for discourse in fact-based conversations. It's just rage bait, these types of things. So you can get a good pulse over where the mind share of people are at and scandals and issues. And it's a great news engine. It's a terrible engine for collaboration.
That makes sense. How has the Cardano community reacted to Midnight and all the developments happening here?
Well, there's 2 groups. I'd say there's one group that are overwhelmingly excited because they realize what Midnight means. The success of Midnight means Cardano can launch a $10 billion project. And a lot of people in industry from the Ethereum side or Solana side just don't think that that's possible. And so that changes a lot of hearts and minds and perceptions, and it's going to draw a lot of liquidity, users, and investment into the Cardano ecosystem. And also the existence of Midnight means that the partner chains model gives us the ability to launch every year, a new token on Cardano, and ADA holders get it, and they get multiple revenue streams because, ADA holder, your SPOs can actually mine both Midnight and Cardano. So you get 2 staking rewards instead of 1. So you get more of these chains. You, as an ADA holder, you get 5 or 10 tokens, a nice basket of indexes. You don't get that with Ethereum. It's nice. Then there's another group of people that it's kind of like the sibling rivalry. And like when you have a second kid, the older kid's like, oh, now I'm like second-class citizen. And they just kind of hate the young kid because he gets more love and attention. We had the Cardano Summit that the foundation put on, and we have the Midnight Summit. Cardano Summit got almost no press. The Midnight Summit, my whiteboard video got 1.7 million views in 3 days. Wow. And we're getting international press. CoinDesk is here. I just was on CNBC. So there's a little bit of rivalry there where they're like, why is Midnight getting all this love and attention and not Cardano? But that siblings love each other. And at the end of the day, Midnight is every time we get an integration on Midnight, we also get an integration on Cardano, and when Midnight gets a tier 1 listing, that means Cardano assets get tier 1 listing. So net, it's a massive boon and positivity for it. The other thing is that the best builders on Cardano, who are really elite engineers, you can say whatever you want to say about Cardano, but we have some really bright people in Cardano. they're starting to build on Midnight, and they're up for the task of figuring out how to navigate zero-knowledge cryptography. So like the Phil DeSaros and the Pai Langhams and these guys, they're extremely smart, they're very talented, they're very capable. So those people in the community are very excited because they understand what this means. It gives them not only the ability to extend their dApps, but extend their dApps with privacy into Solana, into Ethereum, into Bitcoin, and gain a lot more users and liquidity. So it's in many cases like a second act that
Yeah.
gives them a second look and a second set of chances to succeed.
It also gives them like a broader horizon on what they can do. Like, there's a lot of chatter about private prediction markets or private voting on chain so that, you know the end output, but who's voting what is abstracted away and you can't figure that out. Charles, this has been awesome. I know we're close up on time. The last question I do have for you, and I think this is probably the biggest question that I've written down. What's your number one message to the Midnight and Cardano community? They can be separate as well for both communities, or?
Well, the number one message to the entire ecosystem is it's okay. It's been a very hard year. We thought, and myself included, December of 2024, when Trump won, that we were entering into this unprecedented era of growth and opportunity. And I still believe that that's the case. The challenge is the U.S. government, they loved us a little too much and a little too hard. It's kind of like Sloth from the Goonies, coming in.
Yeah.
He hugs you and breaks your ribs. He means well, but he's not exactly the best guy in this respect. So the U.S. government disrupted our normal cycle and our normal ecosystem, and it's created a lot of cynicism and anger and disappointment. And I understand it. You have 4 years in the sticks, FTX and Luna. Everybody's just like really beaten up, and they were holding out hope for 2025 to be like the next cycle. And then suddenly it comes and they didn't get the expectations they had. And they say, like, am I going to have to wait another 4 years? It's like being a prisoner and then suddenly you get denied parole and you have to spend another 4 years in prison, right? And this is their livelihood. So a lot of people are down right now and a lot of people are broken right now. So my big message is widen the aperture and know that if we cooperate and work together, there's going to be 1 billion crypto users by 2030. There's going to be $10 trillion of assets in crypto by 2030. And we have yet to see the growth of that. That's going to be bigger than anything we've ever seen. But we only get that if we work together as an industry. If we don't, it goes to Google and it goes to Microsoft and Apple because they can work together and they know how to navigate billions of users. And nobody wants to go into an ecosystem where when you pick Solana, then suddenly Ethereum hates you. If you pick Ethereum, then suddenly Solana hates you and you're considered to be evil and bad. You have to have a situation that we all share the pie. We all share the reward. And Midnight is trying to reset that perspective and say, let everybody be special, find a way to get their tokens to the next level, and give everybody equal opportunity to the pie.
Awesome. That's such a beautiful message. I think that's something that we'll clip out. I can already see it doing numbers on YouTube and Twitter already. Thanks so much for the time, Charles. This has been me at the Midnight Summit. And as always, keep touching grass.
Thank you
so
much.